How are we doing today, guys? So today we're going through the snatch. Now there are different ways of snatching and I will coach different athletes differently dependent on their torso sizes, shapes, strengths, weaknesses, mobilities, things like that. So this is not saying that this is exactly how you should snatch all the time, and obviously there are exceptions to the general rule anyway. However, this is generally a good starting point for most people to then obviously be modified and adjusted to from this point. So start here and then work from there, and obviously if you need any extra help, give us a yell. So when we're talking about snatch, what we're trying to do is move as heavy a weight from the ground to above our head in the most efficient way possible. This obviously has to be done in one smooth movement, and it can't be done in two separate movements with the press out. Obviously we saw plenty of red lights at the Olympics in the 2021 or 2020 Tokyo Olympics. What we want to be thinking about is creating a smoothest movement possible from ground to overhead with a vertical shape. Now this means that we don't want to have any horizontal movement forwards and backwards to create that movement, whether that be around the knees or the bar being thrust out in front of us. We want to be keeping that bar really nice and close to the body throughout the movement. So how you set up and how you move through that action and how you move your body around that bar is going to dramatically change how you actually do to get underneath that bar and the likelihood that you're going to catch it. So, setup is quite important. First thing, hands. We want to be thinking about creating a contact point that's pretty much right on the hips. Now this will be somewhere between the pubic bone and the ACES, so those two spiky points on the hips themselves. General ways of finding it, there's lots of different ways. Anything from arms nice and relaxed, shoulders nice and relaxed in terms of no elevation through the traps, and then being able to lift the leg up in that position. Obviously, just putting it along the hip crease can also be another one. Typically, it'll feel slightly uncomfortable. That's generally, through the hands that is. That generally means that you're probably in about the right place. Generally, if you come in to where it feels comfortable to grip, it's generally a little bit too low and a little bit too narrow, and you'll typically wind up with pulling or elbow bending on the bar as you're moving through. You want that contact point or hands to be wide because it's going to allow you to have a lower bar travel path or shorter bar travel going overhead. The narrower you are, longer bar path, it's going to make it significantly harder. Obviously another big thing is to make sure that you're hook gripping. So by hook grip, I mean thumb is wrapped around the bar first, and then generally it's the first two fingers, unless you've got really long thumbs, in which case you might get three fingers over the top of that bar to give you just significantly more grip. Whereas if you're just holding the bar naturally with no thumb, that generally you're going to struggle with grip issues once you start getting up to the heavier loads. By the same token that you can switch to that later on, although I do recommend doing it from the start, because that way you get your thumbs used to it when you're still on light weights doing your technique work, because if you switch to it when you go to heavy, it's going to hurt. So once you've got your grip width, from there you want to be starting to think about your foot stance. Now when we start on the ground with a snatch, typically you have to get your hips lower. This means that for most people they're going to struggle with hip mobility issues, with being too far over the top of the bar. Generally, assuming you've got mobility for this, going wider can help, or rotating the feet out can help push the legs out without necessarily putting as much tension through the hip socket itself by creating more adduction. So whichever one suits you, but again, this is where I'd coach different athletes differently, dependent on their personal limb lengths, hip, ankle mobilities, etc. In general, I'm going to be going for about where my back squat stance is, with feet pointing pretty much straight, maybe a fraction of toe out because of the wider stance. Generally, the snatch is more comfortable for a lot of people, mainly because you have more space to move with the legs, rather than having to be as cramped as what you are in the clean. Okay, so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about hands and feet. That obviously allows you to set up from there. Now, when we're talking about the actual movement itself, the movement we are going through is starting at the same sort of positions that we talked about with the clean. Firstly, make sure your grip's right. Remembering where it is on the bar is a really important move, because it means you're just not trying to find it all the time, and it means you can go straight there from the ground. In terms of my setup position, I'm going to be looking to create protraction through my upper back, so I'm going to be creating slight flexion. From there, I'm going to be pulling my tailbone back. From there, I'm going to be dropping my knees down to allow myself to basically sit into that bottom squat position. Now, in this position, you're going to feel a lot of quad firing up, and that's a good thing. From that position there, the shoulders should be directly above the bar or just in front, dependent on the person, to allow you to stay over the top of the bar as you go through your first, second pulls. So make sure, or first pull, make sure that you are driving through the legs as you create that action to lift off the ground by pulling the slack out of the bar. Now, what I mean by pulling the slack out of the bar is getting rid of the looseness in that bar, which is going to typically tilt you forwards, particularly when you start going to heavier loads. You want to create tension with that with the legs, not with the arms. You don't want to be pulling it, with the legs pushing into the ground so that you can lift off the ground smoothly. Once you've lifted off the ground, you are looking to get the shins to a vertical point, which will mean that the knees will pull back and typically a little bit of rotation outwards. From there, the knees are going to come back in underneath that bar so that you can get to a vertical point where the shoulders are still over the top of the bar, but that's going to allow you to then extend upwards with the knees, the hips, the ankles, and shrugging to create a vertical bar path. From that point, I'm going to be looking to create elbow bend, which is going to be traveling upwards, creating internal rotation in that shoulder, so some people will feel impingements here. From there, I'm looking to create a rotation in underneath that bar to get the elbows in underneath nice and early, generally about head height, to then allow me to press to move in underneath that bar into the full catch. Now, when I'm talking about the full catch, I'm looking at creating elevation through the shoulder. So by that, I mean to elevate. I'm not talking about shoulder blades like touching ears. I'm literally talking about slight elevation and pushing away, because that's going to allow for internal rotation of the shoulder, of the humerus, which is going to be significantly more comfortable on the shoulder joint itself, but it's also going to allow you to stack the bar and your arm over the center of the rib cage. If you are too externally rotated, typically you're going to retract, which is going to put the shoulder blade and the shoulder behind the rib cage, significantly less stable. It's also going to dump the ribs forwards. As soon as the ribs start going forwards, you'll find that people's weight and center of mass is going to go onto their toes, and they're typically going to throw the bar backwards. We want to be trying to catch in a balanced stance down the bottom. So you're thinking about elevation, slight upwards drive of the shoulders. You're thinking about letting the shoulder create slight internal rotation as you create that lockout with the elbows. And that's going to allow you to hold that thoracic flexion, which we set at the bottom, all the way through the movement, which is going to keep the ribs and hips as a unit. It's going to be a lot significantly stronger as the bar comes down on top of you, particularly underneath heavy loads in a squat snatch, for example. Also, it's going to shift your load backwards into the heels at the bottom of that squat, which is going to allow you to squat a lot more vertically. So we want to be hitting all these shapes, all these positions, so that you can feel comfortable at the bottom of that rep. So moving through to going through the actual movement itself, I'm going to demonstrate a few different actions and the full movement itself. Then we're going to be talking about a few different variations. So as I set myself up, I'm going to set my hands first, then I'm going to make sure that I'm setting my feet after that. From that point, I'm going to be protracting, I'm going to be flexing that upper back, I'm going to be pulling that tailbone back to allow myself to sit vertical, and then from there, vertical shins. From there, the knees are going to come underneath. From there, I'm going to create my extension and my shrug to then snatch. Creating the elevation at the top before I stand. That way I'm stacked and balanced. If I do one without the talking, so you would have noticed there that I caught the bar and I held the position. Reason for that is quite often people will catch and stand quickly. When they do that, they're compensating for lack of stability. They don't know how to catch the bar, where to position it, where to position themselves with their hips, feet, shoulders, etc., and typically can't hold that position. If you can't hold the position in the power, you're going to be very unstable in a squat. So you want to be teaching yourself to always catch with a stable position, to allow yourself to actually hit the shapes that we want and also drill those shapes. So that's your full snatch. Now, we're going to be talking about snatch variations. So obviously when you're talking about snatch, you've got different variations. You've got your high hang, which is where you dip vertically down, same with that clean. And then from there, you're creating your extension upwards from that point. From there, you're going to be talking about your hang, which is where you come down to that dip. Then you come down to the top of the knee for your full hang. Then you transition back upwards from there. Then finally, you're going to go down to the low, which is going to be just below the top of the knee. And you transition through those shapes to get to your full extension. I'll demo each one of those. After that, we have the tall and the muscle, which we'll talk through as we go into the bar, but I'll quickly talk through them now. The tall variation is where you're starting at the hip, the knees are locked, you are looking to create a toe and a shrug to then be able to pull the elbows upwards as your foot moves to then drop yourself underneath that bar and catch. It's working on specifically your third pull. From there, we're going to be talking about the muscle snatch, which is all about getting the elbow rotation. So you'll hit all the same shapes that we just did. From there, you're looking to create extension, shrug, elbow drive, and rotate under, and you'll typically almost have a bit of a pausing point, not a full pause, but around this sort of area, to then drive upwards into your lockout. This trains a fast elbow position to allow you to press out, but also gets you into the habit of creating an elbow bend on the way up, which allows you to then keep the bar close, to then obviously push yourself in underneath that barbell. So we'll roll through those as well as talking about the pull variations, which is where we work on the bottom phase of the lift. So if I quickly just do hangs, obviously the high hang, mid hang, low hang, full snatch from the ground, which you've already seen, can all be done in a power, which is catching anything from above parallel in your squat, so everything from here up. And then obviously you've got your squat variations, which is all the way down. So you want to be thinking about where you, obviously the context depends on what your coach is giving you and what variations that they want you to hit, and based off strengths and weaknesses. So I'm going to do a high, a mid, a low, and then we're going to go into the muscle, and then I'll demo a tall after that. So if I'm going to a high hang, I'm going to lift that bar to the hips. From there, dip vertically, snap, and catch. If I go to a full hang, I'm going to dip, travel down to the knee, knees come under, extend, and catch. If I'm going to a low, dip vertically, down to my hang, knees bend to go to the low, reverse that to create the full movement. And if I go for a muscle, so remember this is slightly different because the feet will not move. I'm just going to extend and create the rotation through the shoulders, and you'll watch how I rotate under quickly to kind of catch it at about forehead, top of head height, and then continue to press through. The bar shouldn't stop, but you'll see a slowing point. Obviously that one's stuck. I'm going to do another one to show you. That was mainly so you can see the sticking point. If I go all the way through this time, again you can see that fast rotation with this elbow, but it also means it forces me to keep that bar close and not swing away, which is what you would quite often see with quite a few muscle variations or even the high variations. The final movement is the tall variation. Obviously that's all about speed underneath the bar. What you should see here is toes and shrug for me to then move underneath that bar. You might see a little bit of knee bend. Ideally we're limiting that. Obviously as it gets heavier, you'll need to use more legs. So I'll try to keep myself quite tight through the knees, but 40 kilos for tools. Tools are meant to be done at quite light weights, so you want to be quite, smart with your weight choice when you're doing them. Otherwise you're going to compensate and you're not necessarily going to be specifically working on getting in underneath that bar. So we come through, starting at the hips. From there, I'm going to toes and shrug, and then from there I'm going to move underneath that bar. And that was pretty clean. So that's your tool variation. Notice how it was all about me moving underneath the bar and getting a fast, smooth foot movement and pulling myself underneath to get that press more than it was about me extending hard and creating power. This is where we're working on the different variations of the pulls. So, same with the clean. Your first pull is from the ground all the way until the point at which you hit about that high hang position, but generally about mid-thigh, at which point the shoulder starts to move on behind the bar as you extend. The second pull is that extension and that shrug. And the third pull is the actual arm movement to the actual catch. So the tall snatch is working entirely on that third pull, whereas you've got clean pulls and snatch pulls and snatch high pulls, which are going to be entirely working on that bottom phase, which is everything that we spoke about with the snatch itself. So if I talk you through those, I'll do a snatch pull and then I'll demonstrate the high variation. The only difference being is the arm action at the top. So if I drive through my positions, I'm going to come to the top. My snatch pull is going to hit the top with a shrug, and you should be able to balance in this top position for a second. And then from there, the high pull, the only variation is, as you come through, you snap, shrug, elbow bent. And we should be getting the bar roughly to about sternum, bottom of rib, cage sort of height as you do that. We're not trying to pull it there though. We're trying to let the bar have momentum and just letting it float upwards and guiding it with the arms. Again, just start teaching, keep the bar close as you move. So if I do a snatch pull, I'm going to set my feet, set my hands. From there, protract, tailbone pulls backwards, drop the hips, chest is up, elbows left and right, drive, elbows under, snap, which is going to allow me to create that vertical path. If I was doing a high pull, obviously I can do this from a hang. I'm just going to be creating that snapping action and then keeping that bar close to then move towards the top of the rib cage. So we're going to talk through another couple of variations with the snatch. So snatch grip deadlift. A snatch grip deadlift specifically focuses on basically strengthening the pull, the first and the second pull. It's not quite the same as a full snatch pull where you're coming through and up into the extension. However, that should still be the main focus toward working towards that shape. So this is really about strengthening leg drive as well as someone's ability to handle loads that are significantly heavier than what their max snatch is, so that way they can maintain the relationship between their ribs, shoulders and hips as they're driving off the ground, particularly with the navigation around the knees. However, this isn't talking about going to a full normal deadlift shape where you're creating more of that hinging sort of action. You're still staying quite vertical as you're doing this. Now, having said that, if you're working from maybe a bodybuilding standpoint where you're trying to go into more specific about hypertrophy or back strength, there can be benefits obviously changing this. We're talking specifically for training Olympic weightlifting. So if I'm setting myself for my snatch grip deadlift, my snatch grip stays the same, which as we saw earlier in the video, everything else stays the same with my setup as well. So I set my hands. From there, I'm looking to create my foot width, which for me is going to be about my back squat stance. From there, I'm creating flexion in the upper back, elongating the arms, elbows point left and right. From there, tailbone pulls back, drop down so my shoulders are directly above the bar. From there, I'm going to drive up, make sure the hips and shoulders lift together. From there, knees going to come back underneath, and I'm going to lock that position at the top of the rep with the quads and the hips. If I go through again, obviously the only difference being that I don't create that full pull action. Everything else stays exactly the same. The two final base variations of snatch grip accessories are behind the neck press, snatch grip press, the Sotts press, which is done from in front of the body, and then finally the snatch balance. Now, the behind the neck press and the Sotts press are two variations which are all about creating strict strength in the pressing movement and pushing yourself underneath the snatch. So that's very much what we talked about with the muscle snatch, where you're looking at creating a rotation underneath the bar to then create a pressing action. So behind the neck press is obviously done from behind the neck. Everything else stays the same. Elbows rotate underneath as you press and drive vertically, creating that elevation at the top of the rep so that the shoulder sits in the center of the rib cage as you go through, and then obviously pulling back down to the shoulders. The Sotts press, the change there is that you're working out pulling down to the front of the body and then driving out, typically done from the bottom of a squat. However, the variation can depend obviously the height that you do it at, whether it's in a full standing position or all the way down at the bottom of the rep. Is entirely dependent on what you're trying to contextually get out of that position. If you're just trying to train strength in the arms in general, doing it standing or seated is fine. If you're looking at creating specific strength and stability through the hips and feet as you create that press, then obviously doing that at the bottom of a squat is more important. So cueing, what we want to be thinking about with your setup. So if we're going from behind the neck press, because I'll demo both of these, you're looking at creating elbows underneath, you're creating protraction, getting that shoulder blade underneath that shape. From there, you're looking at holding the rib cage down, locking the legs. From there, I'm looking at creating that pressing action to create that lockout overhead, elevation, internal rotation of the shoulder to catch above the top crown of the head at the top of the rep. If I'm doing the Sotts press, obviously it'll be down at the bottom. Same thing, you're rotating the elbows underneath the bar. From there, you're creating that pressing action, keeping the elbows underneath, maintaining rib cage down even though you're creating thoracic extension, to then finish the ribs fully flexed, again bar finishing above the crown of the head. So if I demo both of those, again make sure you're getting into your snatch grip. We're going to go behind the neck first. So from there, I'm going to look at creating that elbow underneath the bar, locking down underneath, pressing out and locking for my behind the neck snatch grip press. If I'm coming for the Sotts press, again, thoracic extension, ribs are still locked down. From there, pressing up and overhead. Now, the final movement is obviously going to be the snatch balance. Now, snatch balance is very, very similar to the tall snatch, just that we're only focusing on the dip and drive movement. Now, there are different ways of doing that in terms of no foot movement, where the feet stay in the squat position. You do your dip and drive and stay in that shape, or having a full snatch movement where you start where you would normally start your position with your snatch and shift into that catch position, or even over exaggerating the feet to force accurate foot movement in that catch. We're just going to talk about the normal one with foot movement, but it can depend on what you're specifically focusing on. So when I'm doing that snatch movement, I'm going to back rack that bar. From there, I'm going to walk it out. I'm going to set my feet to where I would position my snatch when I was going from the ground. From there, I'm going to rotate the elbows underneath. I'm going to be thinking about maintaining rib cage down, that flexion, and stacking over the foot. From there, I'm going to create the dip and drive in the same way that I do it for a jerk dip, in terms of the hips stay directly underneath the rib cage. From there, drive up, create that weightlessness on the bar, to then push underneath and then catch in either your power position or a full squat position, depending on what the context is that you're going for. So in this case, we're going to drop all the way down. So I'm going to do 2 reps of that, just to give you the same demonstration. So same thing, I'm going to rack that bar up, going to make sure my hands are in my snatch grip. From there, I'm going to put my feet where I would naturally start my snatch. From there, I'm going to roll the elbows underneath, lock the ribcage down, center my weight, then dip and go, and catch. Reset, dip and go, and catch. When you're bringing it back down, same as you would do for a jerk, think about elevating the shoulders, think about creating that trap elevation, break at the elbows first, and let the bar drop down so you can catch it with your legs. Do not muscle it all the way down, particularly if you're doing heavy loads, because you'll miss the shoulders. Sometimes a very slight lean forwards and catching into the hip can help just to put that trap underneath the bar, but generally staying vertical is where you want to be. If that bar slides down your back, let the bar go. You're not wanting to dislocate shoulder. And it's got bumper plates on it anyway. There's no point. Cool? Sweet. Hope you guys enjoyed all the snatch variations. Thanks for watching.